Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, yesterday there was a long conversation that took place between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. It doesn't look like there was anything very much transpired during the conversation. Xi Jinping said something like, don't play with fire because, you could get burned, obviously in reference to Taiwan. But nonetheless, nothing that China hasn't said many times before. And there was no specific reference to the supposed, maybe possible, perhaps visit of Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan. It sort of made me think that it's very interesting how the media cover China and the Western conflict with China with how they cover Russia and the Western conflict with Russia. Because while the media obviously, generally in bed with the Western security establishment, then nonetheless very critical, take a very judicious pose towards China. They often criticize politicians for being excessively hawkish on China. And it's so different from the hysteria that imbues all Western media coverage of Russia. And no, it isn't anything to do with Ukraine, because this long predated Ukraine. I mean, remember, that back when we had the hysteria of Russia interfering in all these elections, the U.S. election, the Brexit referendum, wherever there was an election, there was Russian interference, and then there was the obsession with how Navalny was being treated, and then we had all the various sanctions. We had the Skripals, and there always, whatever day it is, there was some reason for hysteria about Russia. And so it is very interesting why here there are two apparent rivals, antagonists to the United States and the West, and why do the media treat China so differently from the way they treat Russia. What do you think, Peter?
It's a huge topic, and we could talk a long time about it. Why doesn't China get more of it? Because the elites are in bed with China. They made enormous sums of money, enormous. Right. I mean, the robber barons of the 19th century would blush. Okay, I mean, this is so important to them. And because these elites are so disconnected from the populace on the left and the right, they don't particularly care. I mean, look at all of the major corporations, like Nike comes to mind. I mean, they're put on the spot over and over again, and it's just like, well, it's just business. But and plus, there's not this kind of animosity towards Asians like there is against Russians. Russians, it's very long term. I mean, if we look at it in the American context, coolie labor, when they built the Trans-Pacific Railroad, it was the Chinese workers from California going east, and it was the Irish from the east going to west. And, they're thin, they're small, they're crafty. But they're not the same kind of threat. Now, obviously, the Japanese come in with the Second World War being very barbaric. They were very barbaric towards prisoners of war, but they were very barbaric with their own soldiers as well. So, I mean, but that's not Chinese. Japanese and Chinese, maybe there's a difference there. But the Russians, it's totally different, okay? First of all, Fortune 500 companies never invested heavily in Russia. There were a few exceptions, and they're more or less gone right now. They're also white, okay? They kind of look like us. So if they kind of look like us, they should start acting like us. They lost the Cold War, quote unquote. So you lost, and you have to do what we do. We tell you to do. I mean, these are the kind of things. And plus, you can go, historians have debated it, does it go back to the Napoleonic Wars, or is it the Crimean War, where this, this Russophobic trend is very deep in Western culture, particularly the UK. The UK has a very, very special place for Russophobia, and it's very much on display right now. And, going back to the Chinese, if you look at the rhetoric, minus the hawks that are doing it for media hype. You know, we just have to explain to the Chinese how things are supposed to be done. Just kind of explain it to them, okay? And then, you know, they'll, you know, we got you the WTO. Now, this is how you play the rules, okay? There's always this posturing, this lecturing, superiority. It's, you know, kind of a kind of a white man's burden kind of approach. And the problem is, again, with dealing with the Chinese, is that you can go deep in the minutia with their soft power English language newspapers, which can be very, very rough and all that. But the Chinese government, you know, saying, you know, we're disappointed. You know, when they say they're disappointed, they mean they're really, really mad. Okay, right. It discursively doesn't translate very well. Right. And also another point is, I think the U.S. just doesn't really know what to do. All right, now. Dealing with the Russians, it's always been the same. You know, they only understand brute force. They don't understand negotiation. They've built in their mind what Russia and Russians are. That's not necessarily the case yet with the Chinese. Just initial thoughts.
Right. No, I think that's all very good points. I don't think that the United States and the West would ever regard the Chinese and the Japanese as their equals. Because, you know, yes, the Japanese defeated the British initially in World War II, but in the end, they got a whacking. I mean, they got really clobbered, and the particular clobbering was one done by means of Western technology. You know, we had the atom bomb, you didn't, and we hit you hard with that atom bomb, and that always, in the sense that the Europeans, when push comes to shove, will always be able to overcome the Asians. You know, yeah, they make their cameras and their radios and all that electronic stuff. You know, that was the attitude of the Japanese. Very, very nice, but they're still not our equals. I mean, we'll buy their cameras, but we're not going to regard them as on the same level as we are.
And maybe it can't be our equals because they cannot be on the same moral plane. But the Russians should be.
Right. The moral plane, but I think also not on the same intellectual, and above all, not in the same kind of geopolitical plane. I mean, it's. I mean, when the Japanese during World War II, you know, they tried to be kind of the leaders of the kind of the Asian people, rebellion of the Asian people. Well, that didn't go very far. They didn't show that they had anything like the skill that the Soviet communists had in kind of mobilizing the people of the world. I mean, nobody in Asia was really buying into the idea that the Japanese are our liberators against the white man. So there was always that problem. And I think the same thing applies now. I don't think that the West regards China, even if it's it will be an economic power. But again, it's a big country. It's by definition, once you multiply anything by 1.5 billion, it's going to be a big economy. But I don't think they regard China as a geopolitical rival that they can't handle, because I think ultimately China will have limited appeal as opposed to Russia. I mean, they learned during the Cold War that the Russians were actually very skilled at appealing to the rest of the world, and they still have that. And I think that's why they still regard Russia as the problematic area. However much they may say, oh, it's a gas station armed with nuclear weapons, they know it's a lot more than that. And they go and they see Lavrov going to Africa, they see Lavrov going to Asia, always treated with great courtesy and friendship. And essentially, we have completely failed. We did not succeed in any way in shaping, the world opinion against Russia. And that's very problematic. So that's why Russia is much more in their crosshairs than China.
For all the rhetoric about China wanting to overcome the U.S., which I don't think I wouldn't phrase it that way at all. I think there's one thing that, people don't want to say it out loud, but, the Chinese have really shown a intense desire to be prosperous. Okay? They want to be rich. Okay. Yeah. That is their top priority. Right. With wealth comes power. Okay. Yeah. The Russians, no, they're bloodthirsty for power. Okay. These are barbarians that have these sophisticated weapons. Okay. It's not the same kind of prism. And also, there's this, I don't think, you know, when you look at with China in the West, I don't think when we look in terms of culture and society, it's apples to apples. No, I think there's the perception that it is different. Not with the Russians. The Russians should know better. I mean, they're part of a Christian tradition, the Orthodox tradition. They've done right things in the past, like they were on the right side on the First World War and the Second World War. But, you know, there's this, you know, there's always been this question, and actually another point I would put in my initial answer, you have a lot of quote unquote captive peoples during the Cold War that immigrated to the United States. You had Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, all the people from the Baltic republics. I can remember very clearly at university, my Eastern European professors, that's what I studied. So most of my professors were Eastern European. They said, Peter, let me explain Russia to you, okay? Only we can understand Russia. And they impugned that into academia. The same is not the case with China at all. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, there was a kind of a fascination, you know, because Nixon opened up China and all this. I mean, there was a fascination with Chinese culture and all this. And it was very cartoonish, I would say. And at that time, you know, they'll never be a threat to us. Okay, we just got to make sure they stay not friends with the Soviet Union. That was the whole thing. So I think, you know, but you know, I think things can change. You know, I always hear this, you know, China stealing American jobs. But China doesn't steal any jobs. It's corporations that end jobs and move them to China. So I really hate when, you know, Hannity says, you know, China is stealing our job. Like, that's not true.
Right. No, I think that's clearly true. You know, but the long-standing tradition of animosity toward Russia is, of course, very interesting because the West was always happy to form agreements with barbarians and savages against Russia. I mean, let's not forget, you know, the West was supporting Turkey, the Ottomans, against Russia. Remember, you know, Russia could have just defeated the Ottomans back in the 19th century, late 19th century. That would have prevented the Armenian genocide and everything else had the Russians been given a free hand to essentially push the Turks out of the Balkans.
And the Middle East may have been completely different.
Exactly. But instead, the Western powers moved in and were desperate to prevent Russia from defeating Turkey. And they kept Turkish Empire going. I mean, they kept it going through to World War I. And thank you, you know, Armenian genocide as a result. So, and of course, Hitler himself, I mean, you know, who supposedly, pro-white and so on and so forth. He didn't pursue a pro-white policy. He actually was supporting the various, you know, ethnic groups within the Soviet Union, and particularly Islamic groups, because he thought they were useful tools against Russia. So there is a kind of a long tradition, just that in order to crush Russia, we're ready to make peace with the worst kind of people.
What's really interesting is that in the Western mind, Russia is the other, and all of the negative attributes you can think of in a human being is projected. It's always projected on the Russians. And essentially it's trying to absolve yourself all of these evil things. If you know, the West has committed atrocious atrocities around the world ever since the West became what we call the West. Okay. Right. But you know, atrocities are committed by those guys. They do it. Okay. They're the rapists, they're the looters and all of that. And it's an interesting way of just reflecting back. I mean, the number of times that, you know, I remember it was John Kerry when he was Secretary of State. He said, you know, large countries shouldn't be invading small countries, and everybody kind of chuckled. Yeah, right, Secretary of State. Okay, you know, the United States does it all of the time. Okay,
right. No, that's exactly right. And it's a kind of an interesting point that remember, you know. In both world wars, Russia was kind of almost accidentally an ally of the West, because up until then, you know, up until immediately before World War I, the likelihood was much more that the British would be fighting against the Russians. It was only suddenly that the British decided that the real enemy was Germany, and therefore, they had to, align against Germany. But before that, it was the Russians that were within the British crosshairs.
If we look at the entirety of the 19th century, it's far more likely that Russia and Germany would be on the same side.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's that. And historians have written a great deal about it. How the German Empire and the Russian Empire were so close for so long, and then there was the schism, and people have delved into it because it didn't seem obvious in the middle of the 19th century that by the beginning of the 20th century, Russia and Germany would go to war. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right. No, and that's right. And so it's interesting that here we have this again this extraordinary animus toward Russia. And you're right that it's the British are the ones who are the main driving force here. I mean, their animus far outdistances the American animus. I mean, Americans are pretty hysterical about it, but the British are absolutely crazy about this, and you really have to think that ultimately there is a fear that Russia will reemerge and as a leader. This whole thing of Russia's China's junior partner, that just shows how foolish people are. Russia emerges as a great power. China will be its junior partner, just as it was, at least in some part of the Cold War, before there was the falling out between the two, simply because it's Russia that knows how to play geopolitics. It's had a long tradition of it. It's not at all clear China knows how to do it, and China's certainly not shown any ability to play geopolitics.
Or are they particularly interested in it?
If we're particularly interested in that, exactly.
I mean, if we have the post-World War II structures like the United Nations, well, Russia always does the heavy lifting, and the Chinese say, well, we agree with the Russians. Okay,
that's right. Yeah.
And so they're kind of they get kind of a free ride that way because they still get the outcome without the anger and angst coming out of the West. So yeah. So many times, I think you and I have talked about it before, when will China step up? Well, maybe it doesn't need to step up if we have the current order. If that order changes, which is very likely, we're in a great time of flux right now, that may be different. But I want to agree with George. This junior partner thing it's just nuts. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And neither one of them would look at the other as a junior partner. Not at all.
No,
because that would undermine what they're trying to do.
Right. Exactly. I mean, the whole idea of just so you measure according who's the junior and who's the senior partner by the size of the GDP is completely nonsensical. But you're right also about the heavy lifting, because it's always been very amusing how there'd be so many people, who were critical of U.S. foreign policy, who would say, well, why doesn't Russia do more? Why isn't Russia doing more on this issue, on that issue? Why is Russia doing something on the Israeli-Palestinian issue? Why aren't they doing more on that? Why aren't they doing more on Syria? Why aren't they doing more on Iran? Well, why is Russia always doing all the heavy lifting? I mean, it'd be nice if somebody else would step up to the plate and take over some of the burden.
That's a really good, excellent point. And another reason why the Russians always get the short end of the stick, because if you, particularly on Lavrov's Middle East tour, what is he saying? What is Russia saying? If you welcome us, we will welcome you. We will reach out the hand of friendship. What your regime type is none of our concern. We don't care. Why should we care? We're not an ideological power, okay? And I think that's one of the great appeals, because it irks, particularly the Fox folks, is that Russia is mediating U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran. It just drives them nuts. Okay, it drives them nuts. Why? Because the Iranians say, well, the Russians will give us a fair shake. Okay, Are you in the deal, out of the deal, a new
Right.
deal,
Right.
bad deal? What is it? I mean, you guys are schizophrenic. You're unreliable. And they probably ask the Russians, what do you think? The Russians say, we have to continue down this path. That's what they always do. I mean, our good friend Dmitry Babich, we've always kind of joked with him, Russia's strategic patience, okay? Well, it ended obviously with NATO expansion, but even after the start of the conflict, Russia's geopolitical position is stronger than ever, I would say.
Well, I think so too, because what we've witnessed since February the 24th has been a staggering failure of I say Western ascendancy. I mean, what the West has failed to do is to mobilize the world on behalf of its cause. I mean, that, hey, we'll get Africa on board, we'll get Asia on board, we'll get Latin America on board. We are on the side of good, and we can get everybody on board to support us. And that didn't happen. And it didn't even come close to happening. And, we're talking about, India, China, pretty much the entire African continent, Latin American continent. Nobody in Asia supported the West. And that is a staggering failure. I mean, that's not just something, them's the breaks. Though it means essentially the West is unable to mobilize opinion in the way that, at the very least, it thought it could in the aftermath of the Cold War. So remember, when back during Gulf War, at least the first Gulf War, when we got everybody on board against Iraq, and then again, even the second Gulf War, no real consequences. So they didn't get the UN Security Council authorization, but here they thought, well, at least we'll get them on board for the sanctions, and they didn't. And so it really is a case of Western ascendancy has collapsed.
Yeah, and when Biden came out, you and I heavily criticized Biden's false dichotomy of democracy versus autocracy. Well, most of the world, they just say, well, it's Russia. It's not the Soviet Union anymore. They're not communist anymore. Right. They're not exporting their revolution. Right. No, they want trade. That's all. They just want to have trade. Okay, that's pretty and fair trade. Okay, and maybe we'll trade in our own currency so we don't shortchange each other. I mean, and this third force, the dollar, is going to interfere. This looks like a partner we can work with here. Okay, and so Biden going to Saudi Arabia and all this ridiculous, they're going to shake hands and all this. For the rest of the world, this is just this kabuki theater. Who cares? And so Joe Biden, where is your autocracy democracy thing here when you go to Riyadh? I mean, there's an assumption in the West that the rest of the world is just plain stupid, okay? And they're not. And it's just the reverse. The stupidity of rules-based order, whatever that means. It means, we're on the losing end. That's how everybody interprets it. Like, it's not going to be good for me.
Right. Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think that, going back to the issue of China, I mean, China does get a free ride. I mean, they see Russia, basically fighting off NATO. And, China can enjoy it, see the gradual weakening of the West, and see, in all sorts of ways, militarily, economically, diplomatically. China will reap the benefits without having really, again, done any of the heavy lifting. But that goes back to what we were saying, is that when that happens, you don't get to be senior partner. If you're just basically enjoying getting, making a lot of money because somebody else is doing fighting, that it's the one who's doing the fighting that's going to be the senior partner. That, because it's that country that saw off NATO. That's the one. We took on NATO, took everything NATO threw at us, and that was it. Whereas you're just enjoying the protection that comes from friendship with us.
And the added benefit that China gets is that Taiwan obviously comes to mind. Doesn't look like Nancy's hesitating. I saw the itinerary. She's not really sure now if she's good. It's tentative, okay? And that'll, again, this whole fiasco, you know, if Pelosi doesn't go and ends up being a fiasco. If she does go, it's a fiasco. These people are just, anyway. The second advantage that China gets from all this is see how the West reacts, okay? And they can calibrate as well. So, I mean, being blazing the trail has a lot of benefits for people that want to emulate it later, and the Chinese are certainly in that case. But I think you inadvertently said it, is that, you know, this is a case of the global South, particularly China, India, watching how inept the West is. And probably what's most peculiar for the global South and China, India, is that these people are really going to inflict wounds upon themselves. I mean, this is something that is so preposterous for the rest of the world. Why are you hurting yourself? Why are you hurting your people?
Oh, okay, that's right.
And did your people, and you guys are all about democracy, did any of your people get to vote on this? Yeah, I mean, you can't take it seriously.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Because in the past, you know, the West would rush in and would try to mediate and would try to, oh, well, India and Pakistan have gone to war. We need to mediate, make sure, you know, let's get a ceasefire and then negotiations and whatnot. And here, the West seems to have no ability, no will to bring this to an end, even though it's clearly hurting the West very deeply. It doesn't seem to have any inclination to do so. And you think, well, again, why are you doing it? Why don't you see that it's clearly in your interest to try to cobble together something, and you're not doing it? And so you're telling everyone else, hey, you've got to negotiate and, you know, you've got to work out a peace agreement, but you don't seem to be able to do it yourself. Well,
look, everybody, Europe post World War II became amazingly affluent and really a beacon for prosperity for a good part of the world. That's why a lot of people wanted to go there. But they became rich and powerful, prosperous because of cheap energy. Right. Okay, and as George has pointed out in our past podcasts, with the American defense guarantees, oh, we don't have to spend money on military. So we'll build a welfare state and somebody else will pay for our defense. That's a pretty good gig to get, George. But now the world will say, well, I mean, the Europeans, they did pretty well with that cheap Russian energy. Maybe come our way. Well, we'll take it. We saw how it worked, okay? We're not dumb. You know, we can do the same thing. This is what they're saying. I just read today, India is taking even more discounted Russian oil. Okay, so much for the Quad, George.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, it is extraordinary that here, particularly the Europeans. I mean, this is where the issue lies, because at least the United States, it kind of knows what it is doing. I mean, the United States, it has energy, you know, it can look after itself. It doesn't need anyone else's energy. Europe, however, is a net importer of energy. So as a net importer of energy, you are in a lot of trouble when you can't guarantee your energy imports. And when you cut off your most important source of energy imports without really thinking through, you know, where you're going to get your energy from. So again, they're looking around and saying, well, you brought this on yourselves. So it's you know, an extraordinary performance on the part of the West. And you know, you then have to look and say, well, you know, you've now moved into a different era in which, yeah, I mean, the Russians talk about the multipolar world. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where we're moving. That era of Western dominance is coming to an end, largely through Western actions. I mean, it's not, you know, that it was the West that inflicted this on itself.
So what kind of demonstration model is being presented to the world? We're going to intentionally hurt ourselves and we're going to diminish our prosperity. Is that a model anyone wants to emulate, George? Oh, it's right. Ridiculous.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay. And also, to go back full circle, Europe has energy problems because of Russia, okay? We have problems with our election because of Russia. See, everything that goes wrong in the West, the elites don't want to be held responsible. No, those guys did it over there. They did it.
Right.
See, that you can just, the boy that called wolf, you can just do it so many times.
Right.
And then people realize, no, it's you clowns at the top. Yeah. You're the ones that are doing it. You're in your private club. Do you have any idea how the rest of us live?
Yes.
Okay. And you know what? Going back to the welfare state that was built after the Second World War in Europe, is that it was a model where you didn't have to worry. You're going to be all right, okay? You're going to have educational opportunities. You obviously don't have to worry about food and clothing and having a roof. I mean, come on, we're after the Second World War. We're in the golden age of Europe, okay? Now all these things are up for grabs, all of it, okay? And these elites keep saying, no, Putin. It's not working. It's not true, obviously. And we're having, this is a reckoning, and this is a reckoning on so many, it's a perfect storm from so many different directions.
Right. No, I think that's right, because of course, the Europeans could have had a very nice life, because ultimately nobody threatened them. But by tying their fate with NATO, they got themselves into a position of antagonism toward Russia. Because if it hadn't been for their membership of NATO, they wouldn't actually find themselves in Russia's crosshairs. So now they've got the kind of nightmare that they didn't really want. So it's really a case of there was never any need for NATO expansion, but having signed on to this, which they thought was free of charge, they've actually damaged their own security. And this is why, and I want to show you something. This is what, why some of these libertarians who talk about NATO get it so wrong. There was an article, it appeared in Foreign Policy magazine, so it's quite illustrious, and it's by
Oh yeah. Okay, I remember. Yeah. I read this. Yeah.
Yes. So it's by one of these libertarians from Cato, and and here look at even the headline, which is NATO is a luxury good the United States doesn't need. I mean, the very title is ridiculously frivolous. Is it a luxury good, when in fact it has been NATO that has got Europe into the mess that it is now.
Since when is cancer a luxury good, George?
Exactly, that's right. And so here we have, given NATO's origins as a military alliance aimed at deterring Soviet aggression, we should ask ourselves, with the Soviets out and the Germans down, why did the United States struggle so mightily to stay in after the Cold War? And then it says, the answer is simple. NATO is and has always been a vehicle for maintaining the United States as the dominant security player in Europe. So this is very sensible. That part is sensible. But then it goes off the rails by saying that does the United States need to remain the main provider of security in Europe forever? Well, you've just said that the United States isn't actually providing any security. I mean, the United States is using NATO as a way of exerting its influence around the world. That's how the United States get to be a global hegemon, through this, maintaining their military presence on the European continent. So it's not really providing anyone with any security. And then he says, recent developments in Europe spurred by the Russia's invasion of Ukraine suggest it doesn't. Germany, Zeitenwende, and then, it says, which was almost unthinkable 6 months ago, Berlin didn't just cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but also established a 100 billion euro fund to bolster its defense and committed itself thereafter to spending 2% of GDP on defense. So this libertarians, these people at Cato, seem to think that that's a good thing. Oh, great, the Europeans are kind of, they're looking after their own security. So, okay, and this is where we want to go. We want Germany to sort of start spending an enormous amount of money on its military.
Yeah, but he doesn't say it, but it's implied within the structure of NATO.
Right,
okay.
But that's right. It was within the structure of NATO. And then blah blah. It says here that the United States has rushed into the breach, sending 20,000 additional U.S. troops in Europe. Blah blah. And then blah blah. And that's here. It says, in 2022, US allies are not too weak to contain Russia on their own. They simply refuse to do so out of the well-funded belief that the United States will do so for them, and accordingly, their people would benefit from spending their own tax dollars on domestic priorities. So
George, you made a small mistake, but I think it was Freudian. You said well-funded. It's well-founded, but you're right on both counts. You're right on both counts.
Right, exactly. Well-funded. Yes, absolutely. You see, this is the problem here. And it says the United States cannot maintain its role as a cornerstone of European security while successfully competing with a growing China forever, and the cheap riding that afflicts the U.S. alliance in Europe also addles its alliance in Asia. So this is classic kind of Cato claptrap. I mean, it accepts the premises that somehow United States and NATO are a force for good, and that obviously we need to keep all this stuff going. Their only problem is that the United States shouldn't be coughing up so much money. The Europeans need to cough up money of their own.
But I don't know why so many words are written here. Why don't just dissolve NATO and then Russia wouldn't feel threatened? I'm sorry. Is that too simple?
Well, that's the thing that NATO creates problems through its very existence that it then uses to justify its continued existence and expansion. So the more NATO expands, the more problems it creates, and therefore, then along comes all those Stoltenberg and say, well, now we need NATO more than ever, and so this description of NATO as being somehow a defensive organization, that is basically, you're providing the Europeans with free defense. Well, you're not providing anyone with any defense. You're actually jeopardizing countries' security by getting yourself into all sorts of conflict. Let's say you're getting involved in the Middle East. What does that generate? Well, that generates a major migrant flow. Well, what does that lead to? Well, that leads to terrorism. When you start expanding into countries that are neighboring Russia, that somehow upsets and antagonizes Russia. What does that cause? Well, that causes conflict such as the one in Ukraine, and one that obviously took place in 2008 in Georgia. So it's this mentality that is so prevalent among the libertarians. I just find so absurd. It is not a defensive alliance. Defense against...
It's a defensive alliance. Why does it expand?
Why does it expand?
And it aims to expand, create threats, and then threats have to be countered. Right. So the only way NATO can stay in business is to expand, but if it expands, it creates security threats that are perceived by countries like Russia. So, I mean, it's a lose, lose, lose. I mean, on every single metric, it's a loss. And a cheap writing and the cheap writing that afflicts. No, it's not cheap. All these countries are heavily in debt. Now they want to go into some kind of arms race. Okay, they can't keep the lights on on the streets. It's not cheap. This is very, very expensive. And what do you get from it? Yep. You create a more instability.
Yes. Yep. That's right. And so here's Stoltenberg's, this is just continuing this. So here's Stoltenberg. He was recently addressing the European Union Parliament. And there he says, as you know, NATO allies provide unprecedented levels of military support to Ukraine. Actually, NATO allies and NATO have been there since 2014, trained, equipped, and supported the Ukrainian armed forces. But of course, since the invasion in February, allies have stepped up significantly, and we also agreed a comprehensive assistance package also on how to help Ukraine to move from Soviet-era equipment to more modern NATO standard equipment and so on. Now, What's defensive about any of that? You've said yourself from 2014, you have been heavily involved in a country that is not a member of NATO and trained it and armed it to fight against another non-NATO country. What's defensive about any of this? Where's the defense part?
You answered your own question, George, okay?
Right.
And very interesting. And we have to at least give a hat tip to Stoltenberg. Yeah, this war started in 2014.
Right.
No shit, Sherlock. Okay.
That's right. That's it.
And amazingly, but not surprisingly, he doesn't even mention the conflict in the Donbass, which two European powers were the guarantors for. Okay. Right. He conveniently takes the context out of everything.
That's right. That's right. And then it says the message was that we will provide support for as long as it takes. No one can predict when this war will end. But what we do know is that the more we are able to provide support to Ukraine, of course, the more we increase the possibility, the likelihood of an end to a war, which happens on acceptable terms for Ukraine.
Well, there's no evidence of that.
Right.
So 5 months in, zero evidence of that.
Right, but you know, what is he doing? He's now saying that you are a co-belligerent. And then he says here, that NATO is not a part of the war. We support Ukraine, highly valued partner, but NATO would not be directly involved in the fighting on the ground in Ukraine. Well, this is the kind of sophistry that you can only get away with for so long. You've just said, we're going to keep providing Ukraine with more and more equipment and so on until Ukraine can prevail. Well, you are a belligerent. You are essentially a belligerent in this war. And for them to turn around and say, well, we are not really directly involved in the fight. You know, I mean, do you really believe that this kind of ridiculous piece of sophistry is going to persuade anyone? Because if you know, this war does escalate, I mean, it's going to escalate saying, hey, you are a belligerent.
He wants us to believe in unicorns,
yeah,
or that men can have babies, okay?
Right.
I mean, this is just absurd. You know, it's really interesting. You know, these articles that we discuss, they would not pass a logic class.
No.
And you see how they shift and shift,
Right.
and it's not even very sophisticated. I mean, you and I can figure it out very easily. It's really extraordinary to me where he can say we're not a belligerent, but then everything we're going to do for Ukraine. Well, I mean, a 5-year-old would say, well, then if you're helping, then you're involved. I mean, this is quite obvious. Okay, exactly. But it's because it has nothing to do with Ukraine, as usual. It is to maintain the existence of this alliance, okay, which a lot of people benefit from, by the way, okay? Remember, everyone, a great, not all, but the vast majority of the weaponry that NATO countries use purchased from the United States. It's a really good gig.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They want to maintain it.
Yes, that's right. No question. And then he says again that well, the reality is that now there are 3 other countries which are aspiring for NATO membership. So the Sweden and Finland, you know, that's already a given. So he's not even thinking about that. And then said Ukraine, Georgia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina, I mean, there are serious challenges. We try to help them to strengthen their democratic institutions, but you know, the problems of Bosnia and Herzegovina as well as I do. So Bosnia and Herzegovina is not aspiring for membership because 1/3 of the population, at least the Serbs, are dead set against it. So you know, you need to sort of write that off right away. If you've got 1/3 of the population, a constituent nation according to its constitution, in other words, they are one of the constituent nations. In other words, nothing can happen without the approval of the constituent nation. And he just says, yeah, well, Bosnia and Herzegovina, yeah, that's, you know, it's applying for membership and it's got some problems there, you know. Yeah, problem, like 1/3 of the population is dead set against it.
Let's look at the sentence. Well, the reality is that there are now 3 countries which are aspiring for NATO membership. That's a really badly written sentence because it should say NATO is aspiring to induct 3 other countries. Okay?
That's it. Yeah.
NATO is aspiring. These countries are not aspiring.
That's right. And then, well, it says on Georgia and Ukraine, 2 different countries. Now the main focus is on to provide Ukraine to support and Ukraine to prevail as a sovereign nation. And then it says, the focus is not on membership now. But of course, everything we do to help and support and modernize Ukrainian defense and security institutions will also move them closer to membership at some stage. So this is a country just being utterly devastated by this ridiculous posturing about NATO. And he's still talking about we're going to move them on membership at some stage. I mean,
okay, George, I mean, if you're sitting in the Russian foreign ministry and reading this, which I'm sure they are, then you get the conclusion that will be drawn is to make sure that Ukraine will never ever be a member of NATO. So they're just signaling, they're showing what they want to do, and for every action there is a reaction and a counteraction, and that will just again expand Russia's battlefield plans. Thank you for signaling us this, because the Russians know what to do now.
Right, that's it. And then Georgia, main focus of reforms help them to move towards NATO membership. And again, so here you can see that this is an organization that essentially, continues along its merry way, antagonizing its neighbors, and promising essentially a future of more and more of these wars, because you're going to keep trying this expansionist path where you're going to come up with against more and more hostile actors. I mean, the Bosnia-Herzegovina, I mean, that's still a possibility that NATO is going to try and intervene there somehow. I mean, that's a sore point with them. And so that's a possibility that they can open up a new front in Bosnia and Herzegovina and say to the Russians, hey, there's nothing you can do about it. We can do what we like. But, this is where the West is now.
And I don't have to say this to you, George, the Serbs won't take this sitting down.
Okay? No,
absolutely not. Okay. What I find really in that article of, talking about future membership of Georgia and Ukraine. Well, what Ukraine? Yeah. What Georgia? Right. Now, part of the charter, the NATO treaty, excuse me, is that countries can only become even a candidate if they don't have border disputes with their neighbors. I think Georgia does. I think certainly Ukraine does. I mean, what they get so ahead of themselves. I mean, George and I are kind of essentialists, okay? I mean, about the U.S. Constitution, about treaties. George can tell you very well about NATO's aims when it comes to the former Yugoslavia, and how the European Union is saying the mischief of the Serbs are not cooperating on having a joint military. Go back to the documents. No, that was never discussed. All of a sudden, it's on the table. Nobody did. It wasn't there. Where is it? Show me where. Okay, memorandum. Right. Okay, Bucharest, excuse me.
The Budapest memorandum, that was Ukraine and the nuclear weapons.
Right, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Yeah. It never had nuclear weapons.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it never had them, not for one moment. And the whole idea that some kind of obligations were undertaken in the Budapest memorandum. It's just not such nonsense. Oh, Ukraine was betrayed because some commitments were made in the Budapest. It's called a memorandum for a reason. It's not a treaty. No one's called it. This is a treaty, a security treaty. It's called a memorandum. There were no obligations undertaken.
A memorandum in this case is just a thought. Okay, just a thought.
Yeah. I mean, they take essentially kind of boilerplate, we are committed to the security and territorial integrity and sovereignty and so on, as if it's some sort of a military commitment. It's nothing of the sort. It's a kind of a lie that's, put out in the media to suggest that somehow, Ukraine really made this huge sacrifices. It never had the missiles. It had no choice in the matter. If it tried to keep the missiles on its territory, it would have meant war, war with Russia. And it's a war that probably the United States would take the side of Russia at the time that there was no way that anyone was going to accept nuclear missiles on Ukrainian territory. So it was just absolute nonsense. Well, we gave them up, and now we got ourselves in this problem, because the West has not fulfilled its guarantees.
Yes, but it's very selective nitpicking, isn't it, George? Because what about the Helsinki process and the indivisibility of defense? Yeah. Well, no, that was the 70s,
That's right.
It's always cherry picking. It's always cherry picking.
It always is. Yeah. Well, okay. the not 1 inch eastward. Oh, well, that didn't mean anything. I mean, that was just Baker talking through his hat, but not 1 inch eastward. Yeah, I mean, it's always that. They always pick on, there's bits and pieces of anything, of a UN Security Council resolution or some kind of an agreement, and say, oh, well, hey, that this has been violated. Because, yeah, it does say I think was it the Charter of Paris or one of these OSCE documents, of the Istanbul document, that, yeah, it does say that countries can choose their own security alliances, but it also says the security is indivisible. You only kind of remember that part of it, where it says, yeah, countries can choose their own security alliances. You forget the one about, yeah, but they can't do it at the expense of someone else's security. In other words, you don't have an unrestricted right to say, hey, I'm signing a security agreement with my neighbor's adversary, and if he doesn't like it, hey, I've got this military alliance now ready to go to war on my behalf. That's not going to work.
And that's not the way it was designed to work. Right. Also, okay, the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Read the rest of the paragraph, everyone. It was a catastrophe for the Russian people. Okay, right. Yes. Millions found themselves in a different country. Okay, right. and no one has put it better than George when I'm making reference to that speech. He bookended the Soviet experience, the beginning and the end. No, George uniquely has interpreted that speech better than anyone else I know. Okay, because I reread it after we talked about it the first time months and months ago, and you said bookended, and that's exactly what you did.
That's right. Because he said the 1917 was a catastrophe for the Russian people, and 1991 was a catastrophe for the Russian people. But again, it's all just taken out of context. So, but I mean, just going back to what we were talking about, at the beginning, the attitudes, I think the different attitudes towards Russia and China, I think it's because, they see Russia as a European power, and one that is formidable, somebody that can actually use the terminology of the West, all the various concepts and the sort of devious ways that the West manipulates slogans and treaties and whatever. The Russians are very good at that, and they've got a lot of experience in doing that. Chinese aren't really doing it, and that's why they often bluster. And that's why I think it comes across as ineffective, because they just bluster. They just simply say, we're not going to put up with it. They haven't really learned the fine tuning and that the Russians have learned over the years.
And there's another thing, when you look at how the two countries are dealt with, when you think of China, you've already alluded to it, you think of this very industrious population. I mean, they make stuff, okay? They're busy making stuff. But you don't. I don't think people think of it in terms of some kind of geographical setting. You don't think of China. When you say China, a map doesn't usually go into people's head. You think, oh yeah, they make iPhones there. Right. Yeah, okay. Or they make bootleg things there. Okay. But when you think of China, Russia, yeah, like that's a big country. Why should they have it all?
Yes.
Most of it's empty. What are they going to do? It should be internationalized. Madeline Albright said that. Siberia. Well, why should they have Siberia? Meaning we should have it. Okay. Yeah. It's a very different mindset, because it is such a vast country, and you have to remember everyone that during the Soviet period, it had autarky. It basically took care of itself. I mean, I explained to George, there's an open market here at a place called Izmailovska. And it's really the Soviet Union in little pieces, because all phonographs, records, watches, eyeglasses, bow tie, everything they made inside. It wasn't always good stuff, but everything they had was made here. And so, you know, the Russians, you know, that doesn't go very far. I mean, you go back to the moldering hordes, you know, we have to keep what we have. We have to make what we have to protect ourselves. That's very much in their DNA. I mean, at the end of the Soviet Union, they got to look around and say, wow, these are nice things in the Middle East and Europe, America, and all that. But they still, you know, we got what we got. We're going to hang on what we got. And there's a really siege mentality built in.
Yes, yes. No, that's right. It's I mean, yesterday while I was doing my live stream, somebody asked the question, well, why do you think that the Soviet Union didn't lose the Cold War? I mean, why do you say they just simply gave it up? And I argued that essentially, well, when was that defeat? What did they lose? You can certainly argue that after 75 years, the Soviet Union was not as prosperous as the West. But on the other hand, they never really said that they would catch up with the West within 75 years. I mean, there was no time limit. And just because you haven't caught up in 75 years, that doesn't mean that the experiment should be abandoned. I mean, leaving aside whether you like communism, you like the Soviet system or whatever, but if you're a Soviet leader, there's no particular reason for you to think in 1985 that you have lost. Why? You know, they say, what have I lost? I mean, we have a good education system. We have a space program. We won World War II. We did all the heavy lifting. You know, we're great. We have great athletes. We have great chess champions. What have we lost? Where did we lose? I mean, yes, we may have lost in Afghanistan, but we put in only limited resources, just like the Americans only put limited resources in Southeast Asia. So when did this defeat take place? And it didn't. It was the Soviet leaders decided to give it up. I mean, that's a definition as to why they did that and whether that was a good idea. But there's no reason for any Soviet leader in 1985 to decide, oh, we've lost, we give up, you know, you won. Why?
Well, the Soviet Union didn't come to an end because of military defeat.
Right.
Okay. No, I mean, you know, it's something that George and I have studied long and hard, and it's a huge topic. But I mean, the way I look at it is that it was a system that lost belief in itself. Okay, and the good thing is to say we can have Russia in a more traditional sense, not the Soviet Union, and we can keep that, and that's worth keeping and worth fighting for. And they bled dearly for it during the Second World War, and so. You know, living here for a quarter century now, very rarely do I hear people say, you know, I miss the Soviet Union. And if they do, it's because they're elderly and things were better for them. I mean, they do have a capitalist economy right now. Capitalism can be cruel everywhere, including in Russia, particularly if you're old. And but you know, what they maintained and actually got back was their own culture. I mean, that's what one of the biggest celebrations of the last 30 years is that Russia can breathe again, because it was a captive nation under communism. Remember, you know, Lenin had he detested everything Russian, everything. I mean, and he was that far away, George, that far away from getting rid of Cyrillic, okay? That far away. They were going to turn the language into Latin letters.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point, which people always neglect, and they always assume that Bolshevism and Russianism is one and the same. And here it's kind of interesting because Stalin kind of deviated from Lenin's policy, because he kind of did celebrate Russian nationalism, particularly. Well, he obviously did that during World War II, when he opened up the Orthodox churches that he had closed down, but he did open them, and he did kind of you know, celebrate even for a while after World War II the Orthodox churches, and then he famously in 1945 he drank the toast to the Russian people, the greatest nation of the USSR, which was the first time any Bolshevik had ever said anything good about the Russian
and probably
people.
until 1991.
That's
also,
right.
everybody remember Nikita Khrushchev, the great reformer, and all of this. He closed and destroyed more churches than Stalin did. Remember that.
That's a very good point, because in fact, under Khrushchev, there was a reversion back to the early Bolshevik attitude towards the Orthodox churches. So Khrushchev actually reversed the Stalin's policy on the Orthodox Church. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point, that it was that the end of Bolshevism meant a revival of Russia. I mean, I think people feel nostalgic for the Soviet Union as a great power, because it was a great power, and people were in awe of that power. And people were afraid of messing with it, and then I think they do miss that. That's gone.
Just to reiterate what George and I are saying here is that nobody in Russia would say we lost the Cold War. People never look at it. That's not a discursive way of looking at what happened. Okay, the end of the Communist Party, which a lot of people were happy about, okay, and that ridiculous ideology that they were peddling, which there were very few true believers in it. Okay, I mean, it was impossible in the way as it was experienced. You remember the phrase, George, actual existing socialism. Okay. Right. I mean, people saw its flaws. It was glaring. Or again, if I can invoke Dmitry Babich, I said, how did you survive living in the Soviet Union? And he reminded me, well, we just commented on the absurdity of it. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was a system that had lost its vitality, and what was clearly happening was, all sorts of party chiefs in the various republics were getting more and more powerful, simply because there was no real direction coming from the center. I think it was dissolving precisely because no longer had any kind of any vigor emerging anywhere within the system.
Well, I'm sorry to say it again, I know they existed, but fans of Gorbachev, you need your head examined. But anyway, we can do a separate video on that. When he came in, a young leader after all the four general secretaries died in rapid succession. We're going to return to Leninist norms. No, we're not going. No, don't say that, please. We already tried that. Let's not do that.
Yeah.
It was a system that lost belief in itself, and for a decade, it was a time of troubles. Okay, but a new Russia emerged, and I live in it, and it's an amazing thing. I lived in communist Poland for 10 years. Okay, I saw actual existing socialism right up front. So when Hannity's always talking about these Sandy Cortez being a socialist and a communist, you have no idea what you're talking about. None, zero. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, with these American socialists and communists, they think that everyone will be drinking cappuccino at 11. No, that's not going to be the case. Okay? That's why I always get a real chuckle out of it. That's why when Venezuelans and Cubans cross the border, like send them back. Okay. They're anti-socialism, that's the last thing they want to hear, which I think I want to do a separate video with George about the Hispanic vote in the United States, because there's so much stuff going on. It's very, very interesting. Yeah. Anyway, we covered a lot of material.
We covered a lot of ground today, which it was good. It was kind of end of week summary.
But you just go all the way back to the top. It is very interesting how their perceptions of China are so different than perceptions of Russia. And
I think that's right.
And I think Russia and China take advantage of it, actually. And it also shows both elites in Moscow and Beijing how the West just doesn't understand the world anymore. They're so obsessed with themselves, how they feel, and all of this. The rest of the world is laughing at it, scoffing at it, and the Western world can be just, it's the caboose on the train of humanity right now, and it's not going to be missed. Maybe visit, as a tourist, visit Rome, like it'll be a big Disneyland. But there's nothing much coming out of the West that anyone's particularly interested in. And with energy prices the way they are, they're not going to make anything that people are going to buy.
No, I think it's that's very true, and I think that you know, even as a tourist destination, you know, the way the Europeans are going, you know, if they don't bring the borders under control, their cities are just going to become quite uninhabitable. You know, people are not going to go to, you know, want to go to Paris and Rome and Milan and so on. If, you know, they see that, you know, it's overrun by migrants, you know, there's makeshift camps, violence. Many people are shocked by the sight of migrant violence in many of the Europe's top cities. So, you know, even if you want to maintain, oh, well, these will be a tourist resort, you might not even have that very shortly.
All right, everybody, this is Peter and George on The Gaggle. We're on Locals, so please go to thegaggle.locals.com. Please visit our store. And as George mentioned, he had his live stream yesterday. He does it twice a week, Tuesday, Thursday. You're gonna have to be starve in between.
Exactly. The nightmare now begins because Tuesday is a long, long way away. So you have to be strong, get through this brutal weekend, and then we're on the home stretch. So yeah, please, Tuesday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Come with comments, questions, criticisms, suggestions, and on the way out the door, think of little Buddy. Look at that. Look at how despondent he is. He says, I don't even bring out the tip jar anymore. So, you know, let's try and put a smile on his face. Dunk a few coins into that tip jar. That'll put, that's, you know, look. So we're very grateful for all of your help and friendship and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can invest in better technology, and above all, the more likely it is that Buddy will recover from his deep depression. So remember, if you like The Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.